Okay, welcome, Robyn Ochs. I am thrilled to get a chance to talk with you. This is fantastic. Thank you for being here with me today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people know you because you are like super famous bisexuality educator and advocate, but maybe you can start by telling us a little bit about like what is it that you do and what's your history? Like how did you get here?
How many hours do we have? Um, I'll start with how I got here. Um, I became a bi plus activist out of self-defense. I came out in the 1980s, in the early 1980s, during a time that I not so fondly refer to as BG, before Google.
Mm,
So when I came out, it was scary. It was isolating. I didn't know um, how to find support or community. I didn't even know if there was any community anywhere because the way now we would just go online and look for things
mm.
wasn't accessible to people at that time. And so I came out alone in silence. And in fact, it took me 5 years to tell someone else that I was bi. I figured it out when I was 18 and I didn't come out to someone else till I was 23. I got stuck in that space between knowing and being. I knew who I was. That was clear, but
Mhm,
I didn't know how to be a
mhm.
bisexual person in the world. I didn't know, what to do once I knew.
Right.
And it was terrifying. So that's my history. So long story short, I moved to Boston. Yay. And I found community. I found community. Several women and several of us created a support group that was called the Bivocals.
Mm.
And one of the great things about identifying as bi is its pun potential is infinite. It's a wonderful, wonderful prefix. So to go with the bad parts, that's amazing and good. So anyway, I found a support group. We created a support group called the Bivocals. We met monthly, and that was life-saving and affirming. And it was a space I could go, and nobody challenged my identity. It was just, well, of course you are.
Right.
And we talked
Right.
about lots of things besides that. We hardly ever talked about bisexuality, but just knowing that I could be whole there
Yeah.
was very important.
Can I ask just like for to give a context, for people who weren't around before Google, how did you find other bi people back then? How did you even locate each other?
That was the other challenge. So I found people because I moved to Boston, and the very first week I was there, I opened up the local feminist newspaper called Equal Times, and we
Mhm.
had calendar listings in the back of the newspaper. And one of the listings was an event that was a weekly event at the Women's Center called Women's Wrap. And they rotated different topics over time. And it just so happened that the topic the week I moved to Boston was bisexuality. And
How could
I
that
was
be any more
happy.
perfect?
It was amazing. So I basically I showed up at a meeting at the Women's Center at a discussion group, and there were 20 women in the room, 19 of whom identified as bi, just like me. The 20th was a lesbian named Madge who had come to cruise. And this is true. And my experience that night was, I don't think I was 100% certain until that evening that there were 19 bisexual people in the world. That's how isolated I had been feeling. And so that's how I got involved. A year later, we founded the Boston Bisexual Women's Network. We helped other support groups form. A couple of years after that, we started what is now the Bisexual Resource Center. And the rest is history. But I became an activist because there was such a great need for that particular work. I was raised to be an activist. I always knew I would be an activist. I was looking for a way to do activism, and every other issue I cared about whether it be racial justice or environmental activism or save the kittens and the puppies activism or save the whales activism or ending apartheid in South Africa activism, or whether it be, women's rights, like all these different issues, there were already people in leadership. There were already existing movements and organizations.
Mhm.
And I didn't see a way to really get deeply involved with those besides showing up to stuff envelopes or, show up at rallies. But here was an area that had need. No one was doing it yet. And I knew I could make a difference.
Oh my gosh. And you certainly have. I mean, just incredible. And one of the really valuable tools that you in particular have as an activist, I think, is that you're an educator. And that has been such a strong part of your activism and the change that you've made. So can you talk a little bit about how you started doing that? And I know I'm teaching an undergraduate course on bisexuality, and it's not the first, because I know you've done that. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that history too.
So my early activism was done through the bivocals and then through the Boston Bisexual Women's Network, basically creating space,
Mhm.
building community, responding to biphobia when it happened in the larger lesbian and gay community, fighting for what I call the beification of the movement. Fact is, we've always been present, we've always been part of the movement, but we weren't recognized as such. So fighting for that, fighting for organizations to change their names. And that was a big thing in the 19, I think mainly in the 1980s. It was a big push, and into the 90s. It's still a push, but a lot of work was done then. The next decade was trans inclusion, adding the T into the acronym. And so it's, I think I see it as part of a historical process. But so we just did a lot of work in that way. In 1990, I attended the first national conference on bisexuality in San Francisco, and it was amazing. And at the very end of that conference, there was an opportunity for people to stand up and share different projects they were working on, different types of activism they were doing. One woman in the room stood up and said, "Hey, I'm Susan Carlton, and I'm about to teach the first class ever on bisexuality at UC Berkeley." And the room went wild. Everybody applauded and just got so happy. I remember thinking, wow, that's amazing. That is amazing. I left the conference, went home. Several weeks later, I get a call from someone else who had been at the conference. She was a rising sophomore at MIT. And she said, "I have talked to the folks in women's studies at MIT, and I've been arguing for a course there on bisexuality. And they've said that I can have the course if I can find someone that they see as competent to teach it." And she said, "And you're going to teach that class?" And I said, "No, I'm not. I'm not a teacher. I'm not a professor. I'm a workshop leader. No." And she said, "Yes." And she was one of those people you don't say no to. I believe she's now on the Oakland, California City Council. And you just don't say no to her. And I therefore realized I couldn't. And I said, "Well, when would you need this information?" And she said, "I need your CV and your syllabus in 2 days." And I said, "That's not possible." And she said, she looked at, again, you don't say no to Rebecca. And so I submitted something which looked nothing like the class I actually ended up teaching.
Mhm.
And that's how I ended up teaching the second class on
Wow.
bisexuality. And it was an amazing experience. I basically did a 360-degree view of the topic. So looking at through the lens of anthropology, through sociology, through women's studies, through political science. I used a lot of different lenses. And so we looked at this one topic through many lenses. Two of my favorite weeks were, there was one week on, I think, bisexuality from the view of lesbians and gay men. And then there
Oh.
was another week on the same thing from the view of bisexual people.
Mm.
And it was a really great experience. I learned a lot. Yeah, and I became a teacher somehow. And I taught at MIT that first year in 1991, but then I taught it at Tufts several times after that.
Ah, that's fantastic. I mean, I think you already had so much of that potential, obviously, to be a teacher, and I'm so glad that someone saw that in you and drew that out of you and pulled you in, because that's just tremendous. And how fortunate for those students who were able to take that class. And so you taught it at MIT and then at Tufts. And I was sort of looking, there don't seem to be any other classes, at least not undergraduate classes, that anybody's teaching on bisexuality now. I'm curious if you know if there have been other things in between.
There have been a number of graduate classes. Ron Fox teaches classes. He's a
Mhm.
psychologist and he teaches
Yeah.
classes in graduate programs. He's been teaching for a long time and in several different places. There have been a few other classes, but they're few and far between. So the fact that you're teaching your class is amazing, and to all your students, like, just know what a gift and opportunity this is, because it's amazing, and we need more of this.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And just like you were saying, we can learn so much about so many different things through the lens of bisexuality too. And we can look at bisexuality through a lot of different lenses. And so it's just got so much richness and complexity. Just there's tons of opportunity there.
Yeah, I taught another course called Transgressing Binaries.
Mm.
I think that's what it was called. But basically, we looked at the experience of people with non-binary identities in general. And so we looked at people whose sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, or race
Mm.
was non-binary.
Oh, that's fantastic.
And one of the really interesting things was to take theoretical articles that were written, for example, The Social Construction of Race, like Omi and Wyatt, like to take that kind of article and ask the question, like, does it apply to the other topics? How is it
Mm.
specific? How can it be generalized? Because I think both are true. It's both specific, but some of the ideas within it can be used to understand the experience of other identities. And we basically just use four major theoretical pieces,
Mm.
and then
Ah,
use them both specifically and also looked at them more broadly and asked that question.
yeah.
The piece on bisexuality was Paula Rust Rodriguez. We used a piece by her.
Ah,
She's
so
a
great.
brilliant sociologist.
So, in addition to classroom teaching on bisexuality, I mean, you do so much more as an educator. Can you talk a little bit about what does that look like now? What kinds of things do you do with that?
Okay, so some of the things I've done, I've edited 2 anthologies. One of the things I've learned over time is that it's not sufficient for me to get up in front of people and tell my story. That's valuable, but it's not sufficient. It's also not sufficient for me to get up in front of people and speak in the abstract,
Mm.
because we need stories.
Hmm.
And so, thinking about it from an intersectional perspective, you need multiple stories from multiple people with multiple other identities to come together and share their multiple varying and perhaps in some ways overlapping stories in order to understand the experience of any specific identity. And so all of my work in recent years has been focused around that. So I edited an anthology called Getting By, pun potential again, right? Getting By Voices of Bisexuals Around the World. I
Hmm.
edited, which is a 42 country grassroots anthology. I edited an anthology called Recognize, the Voices of Bisexual Men.
Yeah.
Because I strongly believe that men get crapped upon in ways very different from the ways women experience the same. And so I wanted to, and also that there were very few resources focused on men. And I decided to, actually, it was intended to be a short-term project. It turned into a book. And I co-edited that book with a man named H. Sharif Williams, AKA Dr. Harukati.
Mhm.
And, it was an amazing project. And that
Mhm.
featured 70 plus men ranging in age from 20 to 77,
I love the
speaking
way
about their lives.
you've brought in voices that aren't your own into this, global voices, men's voices, voices that even within bisexuality, which is already so marginalized, are further marginal within the community.
Yeah, and that's very, very intentional. And thank you for noticing it. The other project that I do, which is an ongoing project, is called By Woman Quarterly. And that is a little grassroots publication that has been around since 1983. It was started by the Boston
Amazing.
Bisexual Women's Network when we first started. And it's what it is these days is it's a 24 or 28 page quarterly publication that again features the voices of women and also non-binary folks who are comfortable in that space. Um, just there's a theme for every issue and people say what they want to say. And it's so powerful and so wonderful. And again, I always try very hard to make sure that there's a good spread of identities from age, race, geography. It's gotten to the point where every single issue, there are several people who are not US based, who
Mhm.
write not for the special Around the World feature, which I also include in every issue, but just on the theme of whatever the issue is that month. And so I don't know, I love this project. And it's also wonderful because there are some people who have written for us who had never published before, who are now out there, using words to change the world. And that's part of my goal too, is to increase the number of voices out there who are telling their stories. And it's I don't know, it just brings me so much joy. And
You're
yeah.
Robyn, you are such an inspiration to me. I mean, really, like you've done so much and so much for the movement, but so much for individual people too. I think developing these resources that really reach people and help them to have a more connected experience than you had coming out.
Oh, one more thing I do. I forgot to say, thank you, by the way. I forgot to mention that I'm also a speaker, that I travel around the world speaking about identity and sexuality in a broader sense, but with a specific focus on non-binary sexualities, on bisexuality, pansexuality, multisexualities, like all the different words that we can use to describe spaces that are either between or outside of the traditional sexuality binary. And that's probably the best part of my work because it gives me the opportunity to spend time with students who basically teach me everything that I turn around and teach back to other people. So, the things are changing so quickly. Our understandings of identity, our language, our terminology is changing so quickly that if I only listen to myself, I would quickly become outdated. So
Yeah.
I am so grateful to all of the people with whom I have the opportunity to connect and have conversations and learn from, because I think teaching is a two-way process, and I learn at least as much as I teach.
Yeah, I wasn't going to get away. I wasn't going to let you get away without talking about your speaking experience
Oh,
because
that little thing.
that little thing. I have had the great pleasure of participating in a workshop that you've done and hearing you speak. And, I teach a lot about bisexuality and know a lot about bisexuality, and you always bring fresh perspectives and fresh ways of experiencing the ideas around it. And I feel like you bring so much creativity to it too. And I know that the students in my class and other people who are listening to this are probably struggling to figure out, how do I help other people understand bisexuality or sexual orientation and identity more generally. And so just wondering, like, if you have any guidance that you would give to people about this, other than just like, everybody go to one of Robyn's workshops.
Well, that's good advice. Um, um, if I were selling myself right now, I would say robynochs.com, right? No, but seriously, I think that one of the biggest challenges of educating people about bi plus identities is that most people still don't understand what those words mean. they confuse identity with behavior.
Hmm.
They think, oh, you're bisexual, therefore threesomes. They think, they basically, there's so much assumption and misinformation imposed on that word that I think the first thing to do, if I were trying to educate people, the first thing to do is just clarify our language and make sure that people understand what it is that I'm telling you when I use these words.
Yeah.
Um, so I always start, or at least very early in my programs, I start with my definition of bisexuality. And I think that definition itself does a lot of clarifying. I also think it's important to look at where these stereotypes come from, because they're not caused by plus people. We don't cause these stereotypes. These stereotypes are caused by cultural frames that limit people's vision and ability to take in information. And so understanding that bisexual people are not responsible for those stereotypes is really important too.
Yeah.
Understanding specifically where they come from. So I do a lot of work around that. And again, storytelling, just specific storytelling. So if I were, not me, if I were just a person trying to explain bisexuality, I do think that telling the story of your own experience is very, very powerful. And I would encourage people to do that as often as possible, especially if you're someone who hardly ever sees yourself represented.
Mm-hmm.
If you think that your story is an unusual one or one that is underrepresented, then your story is really important.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. That's fantastic. And I think you're right that what has been done to capture those stories, the anthologies, your anthologies, there's other anthologies, there's the Still Bisexual project, all of these things that are capturing stories. I think you really hit the nail on the head. We need all of these stories. Yeah.
Yeah,
Such a
because
great insight.
with the Still Bisexual project, for example, you might listen to 2 or 3 of the videos and not really see that much of your own experience represented. But if you look through, you will find, people, there are so many now that you will
Yes.
find stories within that collection that do in fact reflect your own experience.
Absolutely. You shared so many amazing insights that you've gotten and that you really embody, I feel like. Are there things that you would share in terms of what you think bisexual people need in terms of advocacy, resources, and community? If you could wave your magic bisexual wand, what would change?
Oh, we need more money. We need funding. Despite the fact that we constitute a majority of LGBTQ plus people, we get less than 1% of the identity specific funding.
Yeah.
So for example, funding specifically to lesbians or to gay men or
Hmm.
et cetera, we get less than 1% of that funding, which I don't think it takes a mathematician to understand that that is way, way, way out of balance.
Hmm.
And when you look at the data and the health disparities that we experience, there's a need for funding. There's a need for programs. And I think that the BI plus community has been trapped for a long time in its own poverty, because it takes resources to apply for resources.
Right.
And we haven't gotten off the ground for that reason. So I would love to see some money pumped into the movement, some real leadership development.
Hmm.
I'd like to see paid staff. Like all the work I do, I have never been paid. I get paid for speaking. That's how I make my living, but I don't get paid for anything else I do. I don't get paid for doing Bi Women Quarterly. And wouldn't I love, like, it's a part-time job. Wouldn't it be
Yes.
nice to have that actually be a paid job?
Right. Right. Just because it's a labor of love doesn't mean you shouldn't get paid.
Yeah. And I think that, I worry sometimes, like, what happens if I can't do it? I've been doing it for 12 years. I've been editing it for 12 years, but what if I can't? And also the fact that it's not a paid job limits the number of people who can actually do that kind of project, because that makes it an access. And I just feel like everything should be accessible. Like we now, like for the last several years, we do not hire interns without paying them. Our interns are paid, will be paid, must be paid.
Yeah.
But I'd like to see that more true of the movement as well, so that we can actually really, expand the
Yeah,
voices in leadership.
that's great. So good. Wonderful. Anything else that you haven't said that you want to make sure that people hear from you?
Hmm.
It's a big question.
It is a very big question. I guess just generally, use your own resources and tools to amplify the messages that are out there. If you are on social media, follow the people who are doing thought leadership in this area. Add your own voice. Share what they write. Again, one of the challenges again of being a small unfunded movement is that you can put out something wonderful, but it might not reach very many people.
Mm-hmm.
And so do everything you can to amplify voices, including your own. Just help get stuff out there. Tell people about that. Tell stories. The fact that you're taking this class right now is an amazing opportunity to teach, because one of the biggest challenges of talking about this topic is how do you bring it up?
Yes.
Speaking of bisexuality, which we weren't, I think that's one of the reasons it took me so long to come out, because I couldn't figure out how to bring it up in a way that wasn't totally awkward and strange. But I think, honestly, the fact that you're taking this class right now is an opportunity to bring up the topic. I'm taking this class and we talked about fill in whatever you want to tell people about. It's a wonderful opportunity to bring up the topic and use it.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. I love it. People can find you at robynochs.com. I know you're on Twitter. Are there other platforms that where people can
Yes.
find you?
Well, so first of all, we should spell my name, which is Robyns. So totally not the way you would spell it just by hearing it. .com. And I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Insta, I'm on Tumblr, I am not on TikTok. I have a website, and By Women Quarterly is about to launch a brand new improved website, which will be shortly at bywomenquarterly.com.
Awesome. Will
Women
you show us? Will you show us your earrings and tell us if there's somewhere we can get those?
Oh, right, there's that too. So these are my By Pride earrings. And in order to fund and support By Women Quarterly, I set up an Etsy shop. And the Etsy shop is called, Byproducts.
Perfect.
I was not exaggerating when I talked about the pun potential. So the Etsy shop can be found at etsy.com/shop/byproducts. And all of the net proceeds from that shop go directly into By Women Quarterly. And
fantastic.
That's now about 50% of our income. The rest comes from donations. But we also, one of the other things about By Women Quarterly is that it's free. And anyone of any sex, any gender, any sexual orientation is welcome to subscribe to it. We do not have any limits on that. And reading it won't turn you bi if you're not, and it won't turn you into a woman if you're not. So it's really an educational tool. But again, the Etsy shop supports it, subscriptions support it, but we don't charge a subscription fee because we want to, again, make it as accessible as is possible. So anyone with an internet connection can access it.
Thank you so much. Look, thank you for talking today, but just thank you for your long history of commitment to the bisexual movement, to educating people, to bringing in those marginalized voices. And I always use your definition of bisexuality, which I find to be so inclusive and helping people to understand. And so thank you for defining bisexuality in such a way that it can resonate for so many people. I think you're marvelous. I appreciate you taking the time to do this today. And I just know that you have so much to continue offering. And so thank you into the future for everything that you'll continue to do.
Thank you. And let me end with something. Um, I really appreciate everything you do, because everything that you just said is very true of you. You have been doing advocacy work and making BI+ people visible and better understood for a very long time. And I absolutely, appreciate and respect everything that you do.
Thank you so much, Robyn.